One more thing. First of all, thanks for that graceful introduction, and thanks to all of you for being here and for caring about these things. It's brilliant and daunting to follow Caleb. I'm psyched about that. I want to suggest that many of the things, not all, but many of the things that you talked about in your conclusion can actually be brought back to the metropole. The metropole is typically considered, the big city is typically considered a place of consumption, and in fact, all these little markers here on this map designate service stations, the locations of big brand petrol stations. But the metropole is, as I'm going to show, is also a place of production where so many of the issues that Caleb has described are absolutely have an intense presence in people's lives, and this gives, I think, all of us a chance to engage with these issues directly in our own daily lives. The thing that I'm going to be showing here is, in one sense, an artwork. It was shown in this exhibition, along with Claire's work, and also along with the work of Marissa Benedict, with the photography of a woman named Terry Evans, who was one of my big collaborators on this project, and many other people. A more or less activist art exhibition, I'm glad to say, which has also being shown now in the neighborhood where the problems that I'm about to describe were confronted. So that's also a kind of victory to bring your work to the people for whom it matters the most. That's something very important, and we did that with the collaboration of our institutions, not against them. So that's, I think, something that's really, really great. But I want to talk a little bit about the background of this, how this came to be, and some of the other things that it's involved with. In 2015, in the fall, Claire and I were approached by two friends and collaborators of ours, Beate Geisler and Oliver Sahn, who invited us to submit an application to lead a seminar at an event that was going to happen in Berlin at the Haus der Kulturen der Welt called the Anthropocene Campus. And the Anthropocene Campus is a really big event, 10 different seminars, a few hundred people. They're trying to create a curriculum for the era of what's best called global change, global ecological change, where not only the climate is changing, but so many dimensions of the planetary ecology are evolving very rapidly, and in some cases in a very dangerous way. So that's the point of it. For the edition that we went to, the provocation came from an Earth system scientist named Peter Haff. Peter Haff basically says this. He defines what he calls the technosphere as the machine network of planetary extent comprising, and I quote, the world's large-scale energy and resource extraction systems, power generation and transmission systems, communication, transportation, financial, and other networks, including computers, windows, tractors, office memos, and humans. End of quote. So for Haff, the crucial problem is the disconnect between human agency and global scale. You participate in the technosphere, and your input is essential to its operations, and yet nothing that can be done at an individual scale is capable of changing the inexorable course of those operations. The technosphere, as Haff presents it, functions autonomously and automatically, like a kind of God machine. So we wanted to respond to this provocation, of course, and so what we proposed was that these abstract systems, which are known to science basically mainly at the global scale where climate change is concerned, that these abstract systems are all internalized, transformed, and then reprojected anew at the metropolitan scale. That is to say, a large city takes all the determinants of global change and works them over, contributes to them, and then adds them anew. And for this reason, if you pay attention and if you make an effort to open your eyes and also all of your senses and your feelings and your imagination, you can confront these processes exactly where you live. You can go meet the technosphere. So we went to Berlin, and Maya was there, and so she's laughing because we went to Berlin with this idea, and we presented the idea. But the point that I want to make today is that to perceive the technosphere, I think, is not an individual process or something that one can teach another person. I think it's a social process. I don't think you can really perceive the conditions under which we live by yourself or have the mastery to tell other people what they are. I don't think you can even really know them by yourself. I think one only knows something when that knowledge begins to circulate among other people and when it becomes part of a texture of sensing, feeling, imagining, and expressing that's begins to be as distributed as the phenomena that you're talking about. And so I think that far beyond the theoretical proposal that we brought to Berlin, there's a social proposal which takes a lot more time, and I want to talk about that now. And as those ideas were being formulated, this work here and this effort that we carried out together was also being formulated. And so the two kind of developed together. And to see how they develop, the idea is to go to a slightly different scale, which is the scale of Southeast Chicago. Southeast Chicago is, in one way, the former industrial district of Chicago, and in another way, it's the current industrial district of Chicago. It used to be totally saturated with the steel and petroleum industries. Now it's saturated with scrap industries and the remains of the steel industry and a very strong petroleum industry. And it's also, by the way, a site of intense lead poisoning, and what Caleb said about that is so dramatically true all across the United States, especially in former industrial areas, and particularly significantly in East Chicago, where there was a lead smelter which has poisoned the earth to a degree that's really hard to imagine. But to tell another story, which is the story of petroleum, it began really for everybody with the wind. The social movement was really born on the wind. It was carried by the wind. In 2013, in the summertime, there was a windstorm which blew clouds of black stuff into the sky. It looked like a fire. People didn't know what was going on. They thought maybe it was end times coming. Dust swirled through the air. And very rapidly, people realized, oh, it's coming from those piles of stuff. Somebody took a picture, that picture that's on the screen. That picture, actually, by making it into the media, allowed people to begin sharing with each other in the neighborhood that they were subject to a form of poisoning, which is the poisoning of fine particulate matter, again with unknown consequences on the health level, but we do know the consequences of fine particulate matter, which are asthma and especially for children and respiratory diseases later on. So this awakened many people in the area, and I have here on the map the portraits of some of these people who began, and also their stories, which you can consult. They tell, there's recordings where they talk about themselves and who they are and what they do. And these are the people who began the process of social perception that I was just talking about. People, many of whom I now am glad to see all the time, actually. I want to kind of zoom in, if I can succeed in doing that, on one thing where I can show you a bit of a video. This is a moment before, just as the struggle was starting, and before the woman who mainly speaks here in this video became the older woman of the area. She was just a citizen at the time. Okay, of course that goes on and on, but you get the point. This stuff is called pet coke. Claire talked quite a bit about it yesterday. It was being stored in gigantic piles like this, and you can see that the piles are right next to neighborhoods, to sports grounds, and to all of that. And so what happened here was a big social struggle that was ultimately successful and kicked all the stockpilers of pet coke. There were 3 different piles, 2 of them owned and run by the Koch brothers, and they kicked all 3 of them out of the city. So that's quite a win. My role in all this was to try to put this together into a kind of archive of memory that people could use to remember the struggle and convey it to others, and then connect it also to the larger network of which it is a part. And that was the idea of what I was trying to do. We have a call coming in, probably a very important call. Okay, well, so that's what I was trying to do. I was trying to, happens to everyone, don't worry about it. I was trying to create this a form of memory, but also to project beyond, because a struggle like this is a really rare chance to come to grips with things that continue to exist all the time, but exist under a veil of indifference, a veil of a kind of forced indifference, I think, where everything in society channels our gaze and our sensibility away from this spot, away from exactly this spot on our metropolitan landscape, which is the BP refinery here, represented by one of BP's most memorable gifts to the world, and particularly away from what it throws off, what it casts off into the world, its waste, its unwanted consequences that Caleb kept talking about. Here you see the pet coke that is produced from the refinery. Now, the question I wanted to get to was that we are part of this production, not only in East Chicago, but also a little bit further down the river from Chicago at the Citgo refinery, where you also have, again, the other Koch brother turning pet coke into an industrial project, and then again at ExxonMobil. All of these refineries are refining tar sands oil. And so Chicago is the major destination, the biggest single destination for tar sands oil on the North American continent. The metropolitan region processes about 25% of the tar sands oil that enters the United States. Now, how does that work? What are we part of? Is it possible for us to confront that? Can we perceive that socially? Well, I don't know. This adventure is not over, but certainly there are a lot of people now who are trying to perceive this, which is the system of pipelines and refineries at the scale of North America. And for us in Chicago, quite extremely important are these pipelines that are marked in black here, which are the pipelines of the Enbridge Corporation. We have heard a lot about the Keystone XL, which would have carried, I forget how many, 600,000 barrels of oil a day. A terrible quantity, but the Enbridge Corporation has taken this line here, which appears just as a line on the map. They've installed new pumping stations, and they have pushed the capacity of this single 42-inch line up to 1.2 million barrels a day. And how can we perceive that? It's not all going to the refineries of the Chicago area. It couldn't. It goes down farther south. It goes to a different, it's basically on its way to the Gulf Coast, where there's much greater refining capacity and where it can be exported by ship also. So there's a great fight going on just to perceive this, just to make this known. And it's a fight that has been tremendously influenced by the no DAPL struggle, of course, but a fight which began before that and which still has much, much distance to go, because just to understand, I mean, there's a kind of difficulty which is conceptual but also emotional to understand that we are part of this, that our civilization is founded on this network, that the central institutions of our era, which I think are the petroleum refineries and extraction points, are really they're almost the place where we worship with our automobiles, huh? And so, but this symbolic structure is also partially hidden, largely hidden, I would argue, and only through collective efforts, not only at perception but confrontation, and then at developing the kind of capacities that Caleb was talking about, which is exactly what we need, to be able to occupy sites, to be able to transmit the knowledge of generations and generations of harm, transmit that knowledge across the generations, to be able to build up different forms of expertise and also of capacities for conflict, I think, is really central to this whole thing, because this is, we're looking here at our collective, it's either our collective suicide or it's an act of murder by some against others. I'm not sure which. It's a little of both, I believe. And so to confront that is not easy. It's not something you can, it's not just an intellectual object. It's not just one fight either. It's a large thing to do. And of course, things like art and other forms of intellectual practice can have a role to do that. And I wanted to tell people in the neighborhood that what's happening at BP, what's happening at Citgo, what's happening at Exxon comes from here. And you've surely seen these photographs by Alex McLean. By the way, that's all pet coke that you're seeing up there in the tar sands, because they do process some of the oil up there. It does give off some of the pet coke. You've probably all seen these kind of pictures of the biggest industrial operation in the North American continent, but I can assure you that outside of environmentalist circles, no one I've showed these pictures to has seen them, no one. And so if you want to change other people's minds, you also have to accept to make the familiar more familiar, so that it's not just familiar to you, so that you can share it with other people. And I think there's a role for that in all forms of expression that could be fulfilled much more. And of course, I respect very much the photographer who made these pictures, but I'm really interested in what you said. I want to make a contract with you to improve this work so that it takes on more fully the issues. For instance, the issue that in the tar sands, as you could learn if you look at this, there's a lot of information. You can learn things about it. And one of the things you can learn about it is that the tar sands, when you scoop it up from the ground, those who scoop it up then have to basically melt the tar away from the sands using hot water, steam. Heat. Where do they get the steam from? They burn huge quantities of natural gas. So what's happening here is not only this extraction, but also that extraction that Caleb showed. To make it flow, they then have to put natural gas condensate that they call diluent in it. And they get that from, as you showed, in fact I learned that there, they get that from there. They also get that, it's also sent from BP in particular, it's sent back on one of those Enbridge lines all the way back to the tar sands. After the oil is taken out, the diluent, they know how to separate these things very well. The diluting fluid that makes the tar sand goo flow is sent back to the tar sands so that it can be sent back again. So there's a metabolic circuit there that links, that's the metabolism of our petroleum civilization. And this metabolic circuit is in direct contradiction with our own and that of many other species on the earth. So this is something we need to confront and ultimately to break, And I think that those aspects are fundamental ones for this whole problem here. There would be many other things to say about this, but I guess probably the essence is there. I think the map is linked to the web page of this conference, so it's easy to find. How much more time do I have?
You have kind of
a lot of time.
Yeah, you have like 7 more minutes.
Okay, 7 more minutes. Good. Well, that's a lot of time. That sounds like a lot of time. Yeah, that's great. I want to show. So this sort of thing is something that it's new to me. I haven't done this before, but what do you know? Now I'm doing it again. I want to show you another project that is much less advanced in a way than this one. This project is called Living Rivers, and it's an attempt to look at another one of those great systems that compose the technosphere, the agricultural system. And it looks at it again from the position where I live, between two watersheds, here in Chicago, where I can zoom to that area, I think, where what we have done, and this is why people talk about the Anthropocene, the Capitalocene, etc. What has been done in Chicago is that our watershed naturally flows into Lake Michigan. But in order to get rid of our shit, the rivers that flowed into Lake Michigan have been reversed. And they now flow into the Mississippi River Basin. So these questions, which are basically questions of the industrial era, of the era of great cities, are again ecological questions, questions of a form of geoengineering. In this particular case, can also be found at the metropolitan scale, because you can go walk along the Continental Divide in Chicago and you can experience what really is one of the foundations of our lives in that city, which is the fact that our rivers flow in the reverse direction, carrying our excrement away from the city. And that's something that, again, I think is a great starting place. What I wanted to do was to try to see if it's possible to make questions of that are usually reserved for environmental science sort of more familiar, and find a way to show some things about what is a biome, you know, in this case a marshland area, or maybe to look into some things about beaver habitat, and to check out how a river develops its system of meanders. You know, an amazing thing about rivers is that as they flow, they change course. They tend to make big loops. And then those big loops, at a certain point, during a storm, the river will jump its banks and leave behind the loop as an oxbow lake. And the Mississippi is really incredible for that. And its meander belt over thousands of years was mapped out by a great, great cartographer. It's pretty amazing when you look at it, because you see it mapped out here, the meanders of the Mississippi in the past. Then when you look through the satellite image, you can see how those meanders are traced in the earth, how the flow of the water is also a flow of the earth. So the earth is also a process, you know, it's also a flow. In the same way that water flows through our bodies, water flows through the body of the earth. This is a planetary metabolism of which we are a part. And I wanted to use this in a way because the work on the oil system is so devastating. I wanted to start a new work with something else. However, I also want to look in this work at anthropogenic biomes, or anthromes. In this case, it's all about corn and soy. The Midwest is entirely, I'm afraid, about corn and soy. Almost entirely, not entirely, but almost entirely. It's about an incredible industrial process of transforming the genetic structure of seeds and hybridizing them. It's about, you know, application of machinery and very sophisticated technology, satellite technology to the earth. It's about the creation of fuel at an insane cost of water. I believe we heard the figure yesterday, 1,700 gallons for 1 gallon of fuel when you're making corn ethanol. It's of course about a global logistical system which turns the river into a highway and into a series of dams and locks. Even more sort of pointedly, it's about wars. It's I take this from the philosopher Michel Serres, who has this really strong reflection on these two combatants here. They're fighting each other. One will win, the other will lose. One will live, the other will die. But as we watch them fight, we gradually become aware that there's a third actor, which is the quicksand into which both of them are sinking. And so Serre says that what we haven't noticed as we focus on the political combat between the East and the West, between Clinton and Trump, et cetera, we haven't noticed the war that at least parts of humanity, or I say this because Jason is here and I think he's right, that capitalism is waging on the rest of the planetary ecology. And so this is the war that I'm talking about in this section. I go through different aspects of it, whether, and I would like to go much deeper into these aspects, but I'm just going to show you very quickly a couple of them. The question of nitrogen and its production in the territory leading to a massive dead zone, by the way, in the Gulf of Mexico that you see at the bottom there. The application of a poison named glyphosate, also known as Roundup, to the territory, a very intense application of that. The development of concentrated animal feeding operations and of the slaughterhouses which process what they produce, which is a giant exportation of water, of soil, of grain in the form of animal feed, which is exported to the rising economies of East Asia, and which has all sorts of unwanted consequences, methane being one of the most important, nitrates, further nitrogen pollution being the other one that's so important. There's a lot to be said about the way the territory is transformed. Here something we're about to hear about, the Dakota Access Pipeline, and again the entire energy system. And what I'm still working on in this project, the vision section, there are a certain number of visions there. I guess we have a minute maybe to listen to something. Alan Lomax made incredible recordings of Delta bluesmen back in the 1970s. He's known for his work in the 30s, but he did these things in the 70s that are just amazing. There's a couple of them on here and a bunch of other visions that have to do with Mississippi and Great Lakes watersheds, and I'm actually still expanding that collection of things. Thank you very much for your time. Thanks to everyone who's been participating in this.